continuation of the FY16 LIHEAP Performance Data Form performance measures. My name is Leon Leteau. I'm with the Division of Energy Assistance in the Office of Community Services, and I want to welcome you all this afternoon. And we have two presenters today. One will be Melissa Torgerson, and the other would be Kevin McGrath. Let me just say just something to note about this particular webinar. This webinar, the sections it's dealing with are in fact what we've been trying to work towards for many, many years in terms of coming up with outcome measures that data could be collected on to measure what difference does this program make on the lives of our clients. And so just that we've got to this point in time is a real achievement. And now that the data will start coming in, it'll be very interesting to see what it shows and how it can help us in managing our programs. With that, I'll turn it over to Melissa.
Great. Good afternoon. Welcome. You just heard from Leon, and then I'm going to go ahead and do some introductory slides before Kevin does most of the heavy lifting for this webinar. He'll be talking about the performance data form, the performance measure section. So if we want to go to the next slide. Are we on the next slide? There we go. So the webinar agenda today, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk just a little bit about performance measures and the performance data form overall. Kevin's going to talk about actually completing the form, and that includes completing the energy burden measures, and he'll talk specifically about counting bill payment assistance households, how to calculate high burden households, and then what the targeting indices are and what they mean. We're going to talk, Kevin's going to talk about completing the restoration and prevention measures, and then he's also going to touch on the optional performance measures section. At the end of this webinar, we'll go over the resources that are available to grantees for assistance, and we'll also be taking questions throughout the webinar at different times. So we'd encourage you to, if you have a question right away, you can go ahead and send it in, and we'll get it teed up for the questions sections. So you don't have to wait until we get to those areas to put your question forth. Next slide. So we talked about this on our last webinar on December 22nd, the performance data form. OMB approved this form in November of 2014, and what it does is combines the LIHEAP grantee survey that many of you are familiar with and the LIHEAP performance measures into one report. And so the three sections of the form include the grantee survey, the LIHEAP performance measures, and then the optional LIHEAP performance measures. For this year, both the LIHEAP grantee survey and mandatory LIHEAP performance measure sections are required. This form must be completed by January 31st. On December 20th, we provided information on how to begin the form, so we went over the grantee survey section of the form. And if you missed the webinar, you need assistance, or you thought of questions after the webinar, please contact Apprise because we're happy to help. This webinar will focus on the mandatory LIHEAP performance measure section, so we're not going to go back through the grantee survey. We're going to be focusing on the mandatory LIHEAP, and we're also going to touch on the optional LIHEAP performance measures section of the form for those grantees who choose to complete it. The performance measures section, as we mentioned, asks grantees to report on the following LIHEAP outcomes. We're talking about the reduction of home energy burden. So we're looking at energy burden, for those of you who are very new, is the how much of your income you pay toward home energy. And so what we're looking at is how LIHEAP changes that. And we're using indicators that look at the change in energy burden after LIHEAP, but we're also looking at how well benefits are being targeted to those with the highest energy costs and the lowest income relative to household size. We're looking at restoration of home energy service. A lot of you talk to your legislators and to advocates and people in your states about the impact LIHEAP has on restoring home energy after it's been disconnected or after someone runs out of fuel to mitigate health and safety risks. And so we're going to talk about the restoration of home energy service, and we're also going to talk about preventing the loss of home energy service. How do these performance measures impact a person's likelihood that they're going to be shut off? How do we mitigate that before it happens and eliminate the cost of restoring energy service, as well as mitigate health and safety risks associated with being disconnected? There's a lot of detail, and Kevin has done an amazing job of really parsing out and putting this in pieces that are easy to understand. That being said, it's still new to many of us, and so as you're going through, there are a lot of resources to help you in addition to this webinar. We do have a data collection webinar that was offered last March, where we talked a lot about the kind of steps you need to be taking to make sure you have all of the data you need to actually complete this report. And so for those of you who might be missing data, this might be a good way to go back and find out where you can make improvements. We also have a really great resource called the Data Collection Guide we put together. It's a core document with a lot of supplements on different pieces of performance measurement. So how do you collect data? Where do you collect it? What are the forms you need to be looking at? Your release language, how to talk to vendors, and everything you can imagine. And so if some of you may feel like you could improve in some areas, this is a great document to get a good sense of where you need to go, as well as focus in on particular areas you'd like to improve. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
All right, thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to cover the main topics that Melissa had introduced in the welcome slides. And we're going to start with topic 1, which is completing the energy burden measures. And we're going to give a quick overview of this before diving into the details. But as Melissa said, as you have questions come up in your mind as we're going through this, please feel free to type them into the chat box or to click the raise your hand icon so that we know that there are questions. And we've planned for several intervals of questions at the end of each topic that we discuss. So the energy burden measures. So this is referring to Section 5, energy burden targeting of the Performance Data Form. And within this section, there are 3 subsections that grantees complete. These are Section A, which requests data on all bill payment assisted households. Section B, which requests data on all bill payment assisted households for whom you were able to collect complete heating and electric expenditures data for the targeted 12-month period. And then there's Section C, which is requesting data on high burden households that receive bill payment assistance and for whom you were able to collect complete expenditure data. So this graphic will help you conceptualize which households we're talking about for each of these sections. As you can see, Section A represents the entire universe of bill payment assisted households you're reporting on under the energy burden measures. So we'll take a deeper look into those as we go along. Section B, as you can see in the graphic, is a subset of Section A. So Section B includes only those bill payment assisted households from Section A for whom you were able to get the complete expenditures data that you need to report on. And then Section C, again, is a subset of Section B. So as we move through these sections, we're talking about smaller and smaller sets of households that you're serving. So Section C is referring to the highest burden bill payment assisted households with available energy bill data. So briefly, we'll stop here and we'll take any introductory questions, general questions relating to the performance measures and performance data form. But if there aren't any questions at this time, we'll keep going forward. So I'll let Michelle let us know if we have any questions online.
And yep, Kevin, right now it doesn't look like we have any questions.
Okay, great. So we'll move on then. So completing the energy burden measures, which households should be included under Section 5 for energy burden targeting? Here we're talking about the households for whom you assisted with bill payment assistance during the fiscal year. And so you might ask, well, what does bill payment assistance refer to? What we're talking about here are all the households who received LIHEAP heating, cooling, crisis, and/or supplemental assistance that was used to help pay a household's energy bills. This would also include households for whom LIHEAP assistance was used for utility deposits or benefits to assist with secondary fuel payments. But what bill payment assistance does not include are those households who only received non-bill payment assistance forms of LIHEAP, which would include weatherization assistance or equipment repair and replacement assistance or nominal payments to SNAP benefit households. So if you had, say for example, you had a household that only received weatherization assistance during the fiscal year, they wouldn't be included in the energy burden measures. But let's say that that household received both weatherization and heating assistance, then they would be included in the energy burden measures because they received one form of assistance that was for bill payment, their heating assistance grant. So again, back to our graphic. Section A, we're going to take a deeper look at, and that's all of your bill payment assistance clients. So Section A just asks grantees to report on the number of bill payment assisted households served during the fiscal year, and you're supposed to do this by main heating fuel type. The information on a household's main heating fuel type should have been collected at the time of application, and grantees are then requested to provide the unduplicated number of bill payment assisted households for each of the main heating fuel types on the form. That would be electricity, natural gas, fuel oil, propane, and other main heating fuels. The All Households column in this section of the form is auto-calculated from the data that you enter for each of the household main heating fuels. And an important thing to remember is that this All Households column, which again is auto-calculated for you, it should match exactly the value that you reported on your household report for all bill payment assisted households. So when you go to complete this section of the performance data form, a good check would be to go back to your household report, pull out the number for bill payment assisted households, and make sure that the two numbers are the same across both forms. And this next slide here kind of demonstrates that example. The top table is showing how the data are reported on the household report. If you look at row 6, bill payment assistance, we see that this state had 390,708 total number of bill payment assisted households. And then when they completed the performance measures section of the performance data form, the bottom table on the slide, again we see 390,708 all bill payment assisted households. So the two forms are matching in this example, and that's what we would expect to see. So it's a check that you should do when you go to complete this section of the form. So let's turn our attention to Section B of the energy burden measures. So as mentioned, Section A only requests an unduplicated count of bill payment assistance households, but Section B requests more detailed data on a subset of those households. So who are you reporting on in Section B of the performance data form energy burden measures? These are the bill payment assistance households for whom you were able to collect complete heating and electric expenditure data for the targeted 12-month period that you're looking at. Because it's unlikely that you'll have obtained complete heating and electric data for every single bill payment assisted household, you'll likely be reporting on fewer households in Section B than you do in Section A. So let's take a look at how this might look when you complete those two sections of the form. So here we see Section A and the top line of Section B for the energy burden measures, where you're just reporting the unduplicated counts of households that are in each of those sections. So the top line for Section A shows that there were about 107,000 unduplicated bill payment assisted households in your state in the fiscal year. And Section B shows that you were able to obtain complete heating and electric expenditure data for 82,000 of those households. So you were able to get complete energy bill data for about 3/4 of your bill payment assisted households. But as we might expect, you were able to obtain complete heating and electric expenditure data differentially across main heating fuel types. When we look at the columns for electricity and for natural gas, both of which are utility fuels, we see that you're able to collect data for a majority of the bill payment assisted households. But for fuel oil, propane, and other main heating fuels, which are considered delivered fuels, you're able to collect complete heating and electric expenditure data for less than 50% of the households. So this slide is just to show an example of how the data might look as you're collecting and reporting on them. And the differential numbers that you see across the heating fuel types is expected and would be partly the result of how states are instructed to target vendors for data collection. So the point of this slide is just to show that Section B households are likely to be less than the households in Section A, and that you'll likely see some differences in the number of households you were able to collect data for across the heating fuel types. So now that we've determined the right households to report on in Section B, that is all bill payment assisted households for whom you have complete heating and electric expenditure data, let's cover some specific fields you need to calculate and report. We're going to start with how you should report the average energy bill data for electric main heat households. First, there are two fields in which you report average annual energy bills. The first is row B4 in the form, where you report the average annual main heating fuel bill. And the second is row B5 in the form, where you report the average annual electricity bill. So for electric main heat households, you only have one bill, so it can be on the surface confusing as to where you're supposed to put that information, but we have a recommendation for you to do, and it's pretty simple in practice. What you should do for fiscal year 2016 in completing this section of the form for your electric main heat households is first, calculate the average annual electricity expenditures for electric main heat households. Then you report the full amount that you calculated under the average annual main heating fuel bill, that's row B4. And then you enter a value of $0 under average annual electricity bill, row B5. So let's take a look at an example of this. So here we're looking at the relevant fields in Section B of the energy burden measures, and we've highlighted the two rows in particular that you're focusing on, so that's row B4 and row B5. So in this example, a state, say, calculates an average annual electricity expenditure of $1,950 for their electric main heat households. And what they've done in this part of the form is they've entered that full amount, the $1,950, under average annual main heating fuel in row B4. And then they've entered $0 under average annual electricity bill in row B5. It's important to note that the value of $0 in row B5 needs to be reported. Previously, this field was locked, and you wouldn't have been able to enter a value. But it's since been unlocked in OLDC, so it requires a value to be reported. And it was unlocked because in the future, the way in which these expenditures are reported may change. But for now, we're not going to cover that because for fiscal year 2016, you're just being requested to report a value of $0 under row B5 for electric main heat households. So let's move on to some other fields which grantees need to calculate on their own. That is, they're not auto-calculated for you in OLDC. In particular, we're going to focus on the following all households fields in Section B. The first one is row B2, the average annual household income. Then we're going to look at average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household in row B3. Then we'll look at the average annual main heating fuel bill in row B4. And finally, the average annual electricity bill in row B5. Now, it's important to note that there's some fields in Section B that are auto-calculated in the all households column. We're not going to cover those in depth here, but if you're interested in knowing exactly what formulas are used and how those fields are calculated, there's an instructions document that we created and put onto the Tools for Grantees section of the Performance Management website that you can go to and reference to see how those are calculated and understand what formulas are being used. So we'll start with the average annual household income, row B2, for all households. In a previous webinar, we discussed the concept of the all households fields being weighted averages of the values reported for each main heating fuel type. So if you were on that webinar and you're remembering that concept, it's important to note that that concept is certainly still valid, but we think that the following few slides with a different recommendation is more relevant to how you're likely to calculate the all households averages, because you have a data file with individual household records. So hopefully the next few slides will clarify and make the reporting very simple and easy for the all households columns where you're asked to provide an average value. So again, we're looking at the average annual household income. So the first thing to do would be to make sure that you have a variable representing the total annual household income for each household included in section B. We know that in some cases income might be collected based on 1 month or based on 3 months of income. So if that's how the data are collected at the time of application, make sure that you annualize these amounts so that for each household you have a total annual household income. The next step is simply then to take the average annual household income for all households you are reporting on in section B and report this value in the all households field in row B2. Now, it's important to note also that this procedure used for the all households column is exactly the same that you would do for each main heating fuel type, except that in the case of each main heating fuel type, you're only looking at and calculating the average value for households that use that main heating fuel type. So for example, in the column for electricity, main heat, you would calculate the average annual household income just for your electric main heat households reported in section B, and you would do the same for each of the main heating fuels. Next, we'll talk about the average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household. That's row B3, and again, focusing on the all households column. So first, for each household included in section B, you need to make sure that you've calculated their total annual LIHEAP benefit. So that would be the sum of all heating, cooling, crisis, and supplemental benefits used for bill payment assistance, but it would exclude any benefits used for weatherization or equipment repair and replacement or SNAP nominal benefits. That is the assistance types that we don't consider bill payment assistance. So once you've calculated this annual total LIHEAP benefit for each household that you're reporting on in section B, the next step is to simply take the average annual total LIHEAP benefit for all households and then report this value in the all households field for row B3. And a special consideration for this this field in the Performance Data Form Energy Burden Measures is that the values reported in row B3 for all households and for each main heating fuel type should match exactly the values that are reported in section 4, row 5 of the grantee survey, which also asks about the average annual total LIHEAP benefit for bill payment assistance households. So when you go to complete the performance data form and you enter data into the grantee survey and you enter data into the energy burden measures, make sure that this row, B3 in energy burden measures, matches what's reported in section 4, row 5 of the grantee survey. So we'll now move on to the average annual main heating fuel bill, row B4, and again focusing on the all households column. So the first thing to do for this would be for each household included in section B, if you don't already have a variable that represents the annual main heating fuel bill, regardless of main heating fuel type, you should create one as follows. If the household uses electricity for main heat, you would assign it the value of their annual electric bill. If the household uses natural gas for its main heat, you would assign it the value of their annual natural gas bill. If the household uses fuel oil main heat, you would assign it the value of their annual fuel oil bill. And if the household uses propane main heat, you would assign it the value of their annual propane bill. Finally, if the household uses some other type of main heating fuel, you would assign it the value of their other, the bill for their other fuel that's used for main heat. So that way you have one variable for all households in the file that represents the main heating fuel bill. Once you have this variable, then you would simply take the average of the annual main heating fuel bill for all households and report this in row B4. And finally, we'll go over the average annual electricity bill reported in B5 for all households. So again, if you don't already have a variable that indicates the following in your file, you should create a variable that is representative of the non-heat annual electric bill, regardless of their main heating fuel type. So in this case, you would create it as follows. If the household uses a main heating fuel that is not electric, so say natural gas, fuel oil, propane, or other fuels, you would assign it the value of the household's annual electricity bill. But if the household uses electricity for its main heat, you would assign it a value of $0. And that's because on the performance data form, we're considering all electricity expenditures for electric main heat households as main heating fuel expenditures. So once you have a variable created for the non-heat annual electric bill, you would simply take the average of this variable for all households that you're reporting on in section B, and then you will report that value in the all households fields for row B5. So let's return briefly to the concept of calculating a weighted average for the all households field. So as mentioned earlier, this was what we discussed in a previous webinar on completing the performance data form, and it can certainly still be used if that's the procedure that you've implemented. But if the previous slides that we just discussed are more relevant to how it is that you're going to calculate the all households columns in section B, the weighted averages concept can still be used as a convenient check to make sure that the all households fields are consistent with the fields for each main heating fuel type. So we'll just go over an example of how you could use that concept to check the data in your form to make sure that what you've reported for all households is consistent with what you reported for each main heating fuel type. So let's say that you collected energy burden measures data for households heating with electricity or with natural gas. The table that we're looking at on this slide shows the data that you've collected as well as the values that you calculated for all households. And you can use these data as a check. So what you would do here is let's say that we're checking the average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household for all households. You would take the average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household for electric main heat households, $520, and multiply that by the number of electric main heat households, 12,000. Then you would do the same for natural gas. So you would take the average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household heating with natural gas, the value of $550, multiply that by the number of natural gas main heat households, 45,000 households. You would add those two values together and divide by the total number of households. So in this case, you would add them together, then divide by 12,000 electric main heat households plus 45,000 natural gas households. And the value that you get using this weighted average concept of 544 matches exactly what you would have calculated just taking the simple average for all households using the variable for annual total LIHEAP benefit per household. So the point of this is that you can go through your form and review your data in certain ways that can give you confidence that what's reported for each main heating fuel is consistent with what is reported for the all households column. So now that we've covered how to report data in section B, let's briefly discuss what it means and how this data is potentially valuable to you. So it's important to remember that the performance data form is not just a reporting tool, that in fact the data that you report can tell you a lot about your program and the households that you assist. In particular, some of the things that section B of the energy burden measures can tell you are, does the average annual energy burden for all bill payment assisted households vary by main heating fuel type? if there are differences by main heating fuel type, do they appear to be driven by differences in income, differences in energy bills, or a combination of the two? Another thing that you could look at is whether or not your program provides different average annual total LIHEAP benefits by main heating fuel type. If your program does, you could examine whether those differences in benefits make sense based on the differences in average annual energy burden across main heating fuel types. You could also look at whether the change in average annual energy burden after receiving LIHEAP has how big of an impact it has on your program. And you could, again, examine this by main heating fuel type. So these are just a few of the questions. For a more detailed analysis of the types of things that Section B can help tell you about your program, you can take a look at the presentation we gave at last summer's NUAC annual conference. It's available for you on the Performance Management website. So we'll stop here and we'll take questions from grantees regarding completing this section of the energy burden measures. And again, if you're not familiar with how to ask questions, this slide will help you out, but you can either raise your hand using the raise hand icon, or you can type it in and we'll be able to review it in the chat box.
Right now, Kevin, it doesn't look like there's any questions.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to the next section then. So moving on from Section B, we're going to discuss how to report in Section C, which again, here you're reporting on high burden bill payment assisted households with available energy bill data. So Section C, in order to complete this, you must first correctly identify the high burden households from Section B. Specifically, you're supposed to report on the top 25% of households with the highest energy burden in Section C. So the key question here is, what is energy burden and who are those with high energy burden? So energy burden compares a household's energy bill to a household's income. So in order to identify the households with the highest energy burden, you should compute a new variable in which you take each household's annual main heating fuel expenditures plus their annual electricity expenditures and divide that amount by each household's annual income. Now, sometimes we know that there are bill payment assisted households that report zero income. So in these cases, you should assign the household an energy burden of 100%, because otherwise dividing their annual energy bills by zero income would result in an invalid mathematical operation. So in order to avoid this, you would assign them a value of 100% energy burden. And because you're assigning them this value of 100% energy burden, it also means that they will automatically be included in Section C for high burden households. So Section C includes the 25% of Section B households based on having the highest energy burden. So it's important to note that Section C households are not just the top 25% of households within each main heating fuel type, but rather the top 25% of households regardless of main heating fuel type. So you can perform a visual check between Section B and Section C to help determine if the high burden households were identified and reported on correctly. So we'll take a look at a couple examples that you could do with your own form as you're completing the data to get a sense of whether or not the high burden households have been identified correctly. So here we're looking at an example of incorrectly identifying high burden households. So at first glance, we see that 25% of all households from Section B are reported on in Section C. So we might think that the form was completed correctly. So if we look at the all households column, we see that in Section B there were 82,000 households, and in Section C there are 20,500 households being reported on. So that is 25% of the 82,000 households. So again, like I said, at first glance, it shows 25% of households. So we think it might be correct. However, when we look across the main heating fuel types, we see that for each of the heating fuels, 25% of the clients from Section B are reported on in Section C. So in the case of electricity, there were 15,000 bill payment assisted households with complete energy data reported on in Section B. And in Section C, 3,750 of those households were reported, which is 25% of 15,000. And it's the same across all of the main heating fuels, natural gas, fuel oil, propane, and other fuels. So this is a very unlikely scenario. It's more likely that you're going to have some variation in who is high burden across the main heating fuel types, just given the nature of fuel prices and other factors. So in addition to noticing this, we can also look at row C7. That's the average annual burden before receiving LIHEAP for high burden households. And we can look at this to get a visual inspection of whether or not we think we have high burden households across all of the main heating fuels. So what we would expect is that regardless of the main heating fuel type, the value reported in row C7 would be fairly uniform across all of those heating fuel types, because this section we're reporting just on high burden households, so all of them are supposed to have high burden, and the fuel types should each be fairly similar in the values that are reported here. But in this example, we see that the values range quite considerably. For all households, the value is 18.3%. For electricity, main heat households, it's 18%. But for fuel oil, main heat households, the value is 27%. So we can kind of get a sense that the households are not being reported on correctly here for high burden. So let's take a look at an example of correctly completing this part of the form. So here, again, the numbers in Section B are the same, but when we inspect the numbers in Section C, we get more confidence that the high burden households were reported on correctly. So again, we see that 25% of the all households column from Section B are reported on in Section C. So that's our first indication that this Section C is reported correctly. When we look across the main heating fuel types, we see variation in the percent of the Section B clients reported in Section C. So again, this kind of meets with our expectation that we're going to see some variation across the heating fuel types where, say, for example, household heating with delivered fuels may be more likely to be high burden given the higher prices of those fuels. And finally, when we look at row C7, we see that the average annual burden before receiving LIHEAP for the high burden households is fairly uniform across all main heating fuel types. So again, this gives us confidence that we have correctly identified the high burden households and that we're going to complete Section C correctly. So these two slides are examples of what you could do when you're completing the data to try to determine and make sure that you've correctly identified those high burden households. So let's move on to some other fields which grantees have to calculate on their own and report on in Section C. I'll preface this by saying that the procedures used to calculate the fields in Section B should be repeated here in Section C, but with the only difference being that you're looking at a different subset of households in Section C. So our recommendation is that you have a data file that you use to complete Section B, then complete that Section B analysis. Using that same data file after you complete Section B, identify the high burden households that you're going to report on in Section B, and then just keep those households and save them in a new data file. Then you would just repeat the procedures you did to complete Section B on this new file for Section C. So that would minimize the number of steps you have to do, and it would ensure that the procedures used in Section B are the same as in Section C, just with the correct clients or correct households for Section C. However, we think that certain fields that are calculated by grantees are deserving of extra attention, so I'm going to briefly repeat the reporting instructions here. So we'll return to the average annual main heating fuel bill and the average annual electricity bill reported for electric main heat households, this time focusing on high burden households. So just like you did in Section B of the form for all bill payment assisted households with complete energy bill data, you're going to calculate an average annual electricity expenditures for electric main heat high burden households. You'll take that value and report the full amounts under average annual main heating fuel bill for households with for high burden households, row C4. And then in row C5, the average annual electricity bill for high burden households. When you're reporting electric main heat households, again, you'll report a value of $0. So this is exactly what you did in section B, just using it for the high burden households in section C. So now we'll return again to those all households fields that we discussed under section B. So as with section B, there are some all household fields that are auto-calculated, and again, you can access a document that describes how those calculations are performed in the Tools for Grantees section of the Performance Management website. However, the following all households fields in section C must be calculated and reported by grantees. So the first one is the average annual income for high burden households, row C2. The next one is average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household for high burden households, row C3. Next one is average annual main heating fuel bill for high burden households, row C4. And then finally, the average annual electricity bill for high burden households, row C5. So again, the average annual household income for high burden households, using your variable for total annual household income, just take the simple average annual household income for high burden households and report this in row C2. Again, this is exactly what you do in section B, just for the households that you're reporting on in section C. Similarly, the average annual total LIHEAP benefit per household for high burden households. Here, you're going to use the variable that you create that represents the annual total LIHEAP benefit. So those are the heating, cooling, crisis, and supplemental benefits used for bill payment assistance. And you're just going to take the average value for the high burden households that you're reporting on in this section. For the average annual main heating fuel bill for high burden households, row C4, using the variable that you created in section B that represents the annual main heating fuel bill, again, you're just going to take the average value for all high burden households included in section C, and then you report this in the all households field for row C4. So as a reminder, you created this annual main heating fuel bill variable based on the corresponding energy bill to the main heating fuel. So if it's electric main heat, it equals the electricity bill. If it's natural gas main heat household, it equals their natural gas bill. And finally, for calculating the average annual electricity bill for high burden households, row C5, again, using the variable that you created for section B representing the annual non-heat electricity bill, you take the simple average for all high burden households and report that in row C4. And so again, I think the point to emphasize here is really just that the key to section C is correctly identifying the high burden households to report on, and then to repeat the procedures you did in section B on that subset of households. But section C can also tell you a lot about a particular group of your households that you assist. So what are some of the things that section C of the energy burden measures can tell you? Well, first, you can examine whether high burden households tend to use one type of main heating fuel versus another when you compare them to all bill payment assisted households from section B. You can also look at what differences in the driving factors of energy burden, that is income and energy bills, are observed between high burden households compared to all bill payment assisted households in section B. You can also look at whether your program is providing different average annual total LIHEAP benefits by main heating fuel type for high burden households. And again, you can also look at the change in the average annual energy burden after receiving LIHEAP and try to assess how large of an impact your program is having on high burden households. Again, for more detailed analysis and some examples of looking at data, you can check out our presentation that we gave last year at the 2016 NUAC Annual Conference on the Performance Management website. So we'll stop here and we'll field questions from anybody in the audience.
It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, Kevin.
Okay, great. So we'll keep moving on. So now that we've covered how to complete Section A, Section B, and Section C of the energy burden measures, let's look at how the energy burden measures targeting indexes are completed. So the targeting indexes are Section D and Section C, and these are auto-calculated for grantees once you've completed Section B and Section C. So Section D provides the benefit targeting index for high burden households. It compares the average annual total LIHEAP benefit for high burden households in Section C to all households in Section B. And Section E provides the burden reduction targeting index for high burden households. This index compares the percentage reduction in energy burden for high burden households in Section C to all households in Section B. So let's take a look at some examples. So here we're looking at the fields that are relevant to the benefit targeting index for high burden households, Section D. So a benefit targeting index score greater than 100 means that high burden households are targeted with higher average annual total LIHEAP benefits per household than all households. So as we can see in row D at the bottom of the table, the values across all main heating fuel types and for all households is greater than 100. So we can see that in this state, higher benefits are being targeted to high burden households. And the fields that are above row D show the values that go into this index score. So if you were to take the average annual total LIHEAP benefit for high burden households, $583 in row C3, and divide it by the value in row B3 for all households, $491, you get the index score of 119. And you do that across all main heating fuel types, and that's how row D is auto-calculated for you in the form. But it's good to know how it's done and how the data that you're entering into the form is filtering down and calculating these indexes. So here we're looking at the burden reduction targeting index for high burden households. That's Section E. So as you can see here, the fields that go into this particular index are all auto-calculated for you. So the row for B10, the average percentage reduction in energy burden, that field is auto-calculated after you've completed all the fields that you're requested to enter data in Section B. Similarly, row C10 is auto-calculated for you when you've completed all the fields in Section C. And the row E, it should say at the bottom, not row D, but the burden reduction targeting index for high burden households is showing that for electricity main heat households and for natural gas main heat households and for all households overall, the value is at least 100, and it's actually greater than 100. So in those cases, the state is paying a greater share of the energy bill for high burden households than it is for all households overall. But when we look at fuel oil, propane, and other main heating fuels, we see that the index score in the bottom row is less than 100. So it's indicating that for those main heating fuel types, the benefits that are being provided to high burden households are paying less of a share of their energy bill than they are for all households. So again, here the slide is just showing you what fields go into the calculation and how you can understand the way that those fields operate. So for the all households column, the 101 index score is calculated by dividing 22.4 in row C10 by 22.1 in row B10, and so on. So for your reference, that's how those are calculated, and they're dependent upon the information that you've entered in the fields that are available to be edited in Section B and Section C. So we'll pause briefly for any questions.
And again, Kevin, we don't have any questions right now.
Okay, so we'll move on to completing the restoration and prevention measures then. So the key distinction in the restoration and prevention measures section of the form, that's section 6 and section 7 of the mandatory performance measures, is that the sample for these sections of which LIHEAP household you're reporting on is different from the sample that you reported on under the energy burden measures, section 5. So the energy burden measures, you reported on only those households who received bill payment assistance during the fiscal year. But the restoration measures, section 6, you're going to report on all LIHEAP households that were assisted during the year, excluding households that only received SNAP nominal payments. So for the restoration measures, that would include any household that received bill payment assistance, or any household that received weatherization, or any household that received equipment repair and replacement assistance. So when we look at what is actually requested and what you're to report in this, we see that grantees are required to report on the number of times LIHEAP was used to restore service under the following situations. The first one is energy service was restored after the household was disconnected. This is applicable to electricity and natural gas. The next one is fuel was delivered to a home that ran out of fuel, and this is applicable to fuel oil, propane, and other fuels that are delivered. And then finally, the inoperable home energy equipment was repaired or replaced, and resulting in a service restoration. So a key thing here is that this section of the form requests the total number of times that LIHEAP was used to restore service in those following situations. So it's not an unduplicated count, but rather if a household was disconnected from its electricity service twice during the year and 2 times LIHEAP was used to restore that service, those would both be reported in this section of the form. And there are some more resources that are available on the performance management website that you can refer to. The LIHEAP Performance Measures Data Collection Guide, criteria for determining service restoration. So we'll take a look at a few examples of reporting this information on the form. So the first one that we're going to look at is the energy service restoration after disconnection. So that's row A1. And as you can see in the table at the top of this slide, there are some fields that are grayed out. So that would be fuel oil, propane, and other fuels, but that the fields for electricity and natural gas are not grayed out. And that's because energy service restoration after disconnection is applicable to electricity and natural gas, but for fuel oil, propane, and other fuels, it's not applicable, and those data are entered in the row beneath. So grantees should report on the number of times energy service was restored after disconnection separately for electricity and for natural gas. And in this section of the form, you're reporting on by energy source, not by main heating fuel type necessarily. So energy source is referring to the fuel source where the LIHEAP benefit was applied. So in a lot of cases, that might be the household's main heating fuel type, but in some cases, it might not be. So, you know, perhaps a household uses a delivered fuel main heating type, but the LIHEAP benefit was applied to their electricity account instead. And so in this case, if that LIHEAP benefit resulted in a service restoration, they would be counted under electricity, not under the delivered fuel that they use for their main heating. It's also important to note that the all occurrences column in this section of the form is auto-calculated for grantees. So here you just enter the data under the individual energy sources, and then the all occurrences column will auto-calculate as you enter those data. Another important thing to note is that for fiscal year 2016, electric prepay clients whose account ran out of funds and who had their energy service restored with a LIHEAP benefit should be reported under row A1 for disconnection in the electricity column. If applicable, you should include a note on your form indicating that there are some prepay electricity clients counted in the energy service restoration after disconnection. And also, this guidance is applicable for fiscal year 2016, but will be reviewed going forward. So the procedure for this year is report those households under row A1, energy service restoration after disconnection, and if possible, make a note of this in your form. So we'll move on to row A2, which is fuel was delivered to a home that ran out of fuel. So here, we're looking at the number of times a home with a delivered fuel that ran out of that fuel was received a LIHEAP benefit that resulted in a fuel delivery that restored their energy service. So again, just as with the previous row, you're going to report this by energy source where the LIHEAP benefit was applied. So if the LIHEAP benefit was applied to a fuel oil account, you report it there. If it was applied to a propane account, you report it there. And this does not necessarily align with what the household's main heating fuel type would be. So it's important to remember that and to keep track and report on the energy source where the LIHEAP benefit was applied in this section of the form. Again, the all occurrences column will be auto-calculated for you, so you enter the data for each energy source, but you don't need to enter the data in the all occurrences column. And finally, we'll move on to the repair and replacement of inoperable home energy equipment. That's row A3 in this section of the form. So here, you're reporting on the number of occurrences during the fiscal year in which a household's inoperable heating or cooling equipment was repaired or replaced using LIHEAP assistance. In this case, the energy source that you're reporting by means that it's the fuel source for the equipment that was repaired or replaced. So, you know, if it was an AC equipment that was repaired, you know, it would be reported under electricity. But if it was heating equipment that was repaired and the household's main heating equipment was natural gas, you would report it under the natural gas column for repair or replacement of inoperable home energy equipment. Again, you know, as with the other rows in this section of the form, you're reporting the total number of times that LIHEAP assistance was used to repair or replace a household's inoperable equipment. So each separate occurrence should be reported on in this section of the form. And just like with the other rows, the all occurrences column is auto-calculated for you. So as you enter the data into the columns for each energy source, the all occurrences column will auto-calculate. So we'll pause briefly and take any questions.
We don't have any questions at this time, Kevin. Oh, wait, one just came in. The question is, are cooling units excluded?
I'm assuming that that's referring to row A3 in particular. In that case, cooling units are included. So row A3 is repair and replacement of inoperable home energy equipment. And so if the household's cooling equipment was inoperable and a LIHEAP benefit was applied that made it operable again, then yes, that's included.
All right, it looks like that's our only question for now.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next part of this section, which is the prevention measures, prevention of loss of home energy service. So again, just like with the restoration of a home energy service, the households on which you're reporting here for prevention of loss of home energy service differ from those reported in the energy burden measures. So prevention measures should include all LIHEAP households, excluding the households that only receive the SNAP nominal payment benefit. So that would be your bill payment assistance households, your weatherization assistance households, and your equipment repair and replacement assistance households. And one important thing here is that the criteria for prevention of home energy loss are defined by each individual grantee. So what imminent risk of running out of fuel or any other definition that might be used to say that this household was prevented from losing their home energy service, those are going to be defined individually by grantees. Here on this part of the form, just like with the restoration measures, we're looking at 3 different fields that we want to find out information and report it. So first, we are going to report on the total number of times LIHEAP was used to prevent service loss under these conditions. The first is households with a utility past due notice, past due or disconnect notice, households with limited fuel, and that's particularly where the definition of prevention of home energy loss is very applicable. And also, it's very applicable where home energy loss was prevented for equipment repair and replacement. So let's take a look at some of these examples of reporting this. Basically, the form is structured and works just like the restoration of home energy service section of the form, just you're reporting on instances where a household's home energy loss was prevented. So the first one is a past due or utility disconnect notice. And in this case, you're reporting on households, on all occurrences in which households had a past due or disconnect notice at the time of application and receipt of LIHEAP assistance resulted in the continuance of home energy service for that household. Here, if the household has already been disconnected, they are counted in the restoration measures section of the form, not the prevention of loss section. So again, grantees are to report by energy source, and then the all occurrences column is auto-calculated for them. And in this case, just like with the restoration measures section of the form, energy source refers to the fuel source to which the LIHEAP benefit was applied. So if the household had a past due electricity bill notice and LIHEAP was applied to the electricity account and the household service was maintained as a result, then they would be counted here. Again, with the prepay clients for electricity for fiscal year 2016, if an electric prepay account is low on funds and the client received the LIHEAP benefit that prevented the loss of their energy service, they should be reported in row A1, past due or disconnect notice under electricity. And grantees, if they're reporting on such clients, they should try to include a note of this on their form. And again, this guidance might change in future years, but this is how it's requested to be reported for fiscal year 2016. Again, just like in the restoration measures section of the form, for row A1, fuel oil, propane, and other fuels are grayed out because the data are not collected in that particular energy source column. So we'll move on to households who were prevented from loss of home energy service but were at imminent risk of running out of fuel. So again, grantees should report on the total number of occurrences in which households were at imminent risk of running out of fuel as defined by each state at the time of their application, and the receipt of LIHEAP assistance resulted in the delivery of fuel. Again, if the household was already out of fuel, they are not counted in this section of the form, but rather they're counted in the restoration measures section. So again, grantees are asked to report by energy source the fuel source to which the LIHEAP benefit was applied and the delivery of the fuel was made. and the all occurrences column will be auto-calculated once you enter the data into the respective energy source columns. Electricity and natural gas are blacked out in this particular row because they're reported on in the row above. And finally, we'll move on to the repair and replacement of operable equipment to prevent the prevent loss of home energy service. So in this case, grantees should report on the number of occurrences in which LIHEAP heating or cooling equipment was repaired or replaced, and doing so prevented a household's loss of energy service. So if the household's heating or cooling equipment was already inoperable or red tagged at the time of application, they should not be included in this section of the form, but rather counted in the restoration measures. So here, grantees report on the number of occurrences in which LIHEAP assistance was used to repair and replace a household's operable home energy equipment based on the fuel source for the equipment that was repaired or replaced. So this is always going to be the household's primary heating source or their electric source if we're talking about cooling equipment. Again, you report on the total number of occurrences, so if this occurred multiple times in a year for a single household, you still report each of those separate occurrences rather than just one household. And the all occurrences column will be auto-calculated for you, just as with the other rows in this section of the form. So we'll stop again and take any questions that have come up.
It doesn't look like we have any additional questions, Kevin.
Okay, so we'll move on to the final topic then, which are the optional performance measures. So what we've been discussing so far are the mandatory performance measures, but for fiscal year 2016, grantees have the option to report some additional non-mandatory performance measures. These include energy consumption data by main heating fuel type. So in the previous sections for energy burden measures, we were talking about energy expenditure data, but optionally grantees can report energy consumption data, and they would do so for all bill payment assisted households with energy consumption data. So that would be equivalent to those in section B that we discussed earlier. And they would do so also for the high burden bill payment assisted households, again equivalent to section C for energy bill data. Another optional performance measure that's requested is unduplicated counts of bill payment assisted households using different types of supplemental heating. So that would be electricity or wood or other fuels for supplemental heating. And they would do this by the household's main heating fuel type. So this would give a sense of not only what types of main heating fuels are being used, but how many households are also using supplemental heating fuels. Another optional performance measure is the unduplicated count of bill payment assisted households using central AC or window AC for cooling by their main heating fuel type. So again, trying to collect more information on the use of cooling since much of the form is focused on use of heating. And finally, the last optional performance measure for fiscal year 2016 are the unduplicated counts of LIHEAP-assisted households for whom energy service was restored or energy service loss was prevented by energy source. So as we just discussed in the restoration and prevention measures sections of the form, those are total counts. So those are, if a household received assistance that restored their service 3 times, they're counted 3 times. But in the optional performance measures, states can report on that household just once to say that this many unduplicated households were restored with their energy service or their service loss was prevented. So those are the optional performance measures for fiscal year 2016. And at this time, we're not going to provide guidance in this webinar on how to complete those, but rather We're going to send some further information after the PMIWG meeting next week, where we're going to be discussing this guidance for these measures with the data team. So we've been working on some tools to help grantees who are choosing to report the optional performance measures, and we want to run those by the data team first and get their feedback before providing those tools and guidance to you on completing the optional performance measures. So with that, I'm going to turn the webinar back over to Melissa, who's going to go run through some of the resources that are available to you as you embark down the journey of completing the performance measures.
Hi there. So we know that people learn in a lot of different ways, and we also know that people need different kinds of information at different points. And so we're going to kind of run through these kind of 5 places where you can access resources for assistance. And we'll go into detail about webinars, the data collection guide, the form and instructions, the performance management website, and the TNTA contact. So if you go to the next slide. We're going to start with webinars. In December, we started with the household report webinar, and we also went over the grantee survey for the performance data form. And so right now you can access the 2016 report webinar on YouTube. That's the first link. And we're going to have the grantee survey webinar up shortly. But we do have another from 2015, the performance data form grantee survey webinar available that you can look at. There are only a few changes. And then we also have the PM data collection webinar, and this is what we talked about earlier, where many of you are still figuring out or want to improve the way that you're collecting data so that you can complete this report. And this is kind of a great quick start guide along with a lot of supplements for how to get the data you need. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the data form and instructions. You know, we spent a lot of time putting together instructions that would be useful to both grantees and your IIT folks or your fiscal folks or whoever on your staff might be putting together these numbers or calculating these numbers for the report. And Kevin went through pieces of these instructions in the webinar, but for those of you who are maybe more visual people, I really recommend reading through the performance data form instructions. They were written very thoughtfully. There were a lot of drafts, I remember, and so I'd encourage you to read through them and maybe catch some of the details as you go through this and you start working on it. The link is here. There's also a link for the form. And we have a frequently asked questions page where some of the questions, you know, we heard today about cooling units, and some of the finer details that Kevin went over are in this FAQ document that's very easy to access, and we encourage you to read it. We also encourage you to contact us if you think there should be other questions on there that maybe we haven't thought of or that would be helpful to you or you think would be helpful to other grantees. I can't stress enough the value of the performance management website. You know, we've been talking about this now for some time. Now that you're filling out you know, this form and you're working more closely with data and you've got your hands on it now and you're actually seeing it, this website will be even more useful. There's a whole section on grantee resources. As you know, the data warehouse is there as well. But a lot of these instructions and FAQ documents and newsletters about how your fellow grantees are overcoming obstacles with performance measures, or I mean, just every kind of resource you can imagine is kind of grouped in this one website. And so I'd encourage you to visit, and Travis at the Clearinghouse will help you if you have forgotten your password or you don't yet have a login or any of those things. Travis is available to help you access that website. We have our contact information here. You can contact any one of us for assistance if you need help with performance management, and that goes really for any of the forms we've discussed. Remember that we've talked about this in past regional trainings, but everything from your state plan to your carryover and reallotment to your household report to your grantee survey, all those reports are really a piece of performance management. And then these measures, of course, that are required for the first time this year are a big piece of that as well. So if you need help piecing together any of those reports or working to collect data, to pull it out of your system, to update your system so that you can get better data. All of those pieces, we're available and you can contact any of us. Michelle is also on the call today. She's the one who you heard taking questions. And Kevin, as you heard throughout the presentation, and all of us are readily available to help you. So we're going to use the rest of the time to take any outstanding questions you might have. For those of you who need some time to process, of course, contact us with questions after the webinar as well, but we're ready to take your questions now.
Yes, Melissa, we do have one call-in question from Kathy. So Kathy, I'm going to unmute you now. You should be unmuted, Kathy.
Thank you. This is Kathy at Maine Housing. One question I have is about the optional performance measures, and I noticed that all of the slides say it's optional for 2016. Is this an indicator that they're going to be considered mandatory at some point in the future?
I can tell you with confidence that that isn't in the near future. David, would you want to chime in on that, or Leon?
There is the way that these data collection forms are designed or approved is they have to go to OMB for clearance. And the form that was cleared for 3 years for FY 15, 16, and 17 had those data as optional. For FY 18, that form will be resubmitted to OMB. And for FY 18, 19, and 20, and it is possible that OCS would decide to make those data mandatory for 18, 19, and 20. But you would see if OCS considered doing that, there would be a 60-day notice at which time the form would be presented and people could comment. And then there would be a 30-day notice, and that whole process would go through. So at this time, it is it is optional. At some time in the future, it might be proposed to become mandatory, but it would only become mandatory after there were time for people to comment and for OMB to HHS to make a case if they decided it should be mandatory, and for OMB to decide whether or not they wanted to make it mandatory.
Thank you. That's a very helpful explanation, but I do have a follow-up question. So I understand that, and so then I can be assured, or we can be assured, that it will not be mandatory for 17 because, as you said, the form that has been approved through OMB, submitted and approved, is only through 217. My question is, how soon would a proposal, I get the process, but how soon would you be proposing for 18, 19, and 20? My question is because, as you know, data collection is usually much more facilitative if you have a database system that enables you to easily collect the data and report on it. And I know that we currently have a statewide database for LIHEAP, and however, you know, there may be a point within the next year or two, well, where we will be looking at other options, you know, to upgrade or update our current database, and so wanting to understand how soon you would be required if you were proposing a new
So again, this is Kathy. This is David Carroll from Reprise, and we would not be proposing anything. This would be proposed by the Office of Community Services. They will be doing a renewal of that form during the first 6 months of this year.
Okay.
So during the first 6 months of this year, you will see a 60-day notice for renewal of the form with a description of what the intentions are, and you will see a final submission with what the intentions are. And so that will give you, you will know in the next 6 months, and hopefully even in the next 3 months, what the intent is. You also should, if you have an opinion on whether those data should or should not be collected, please feel free to send emails to HHS at this time, because just know they are looking at that form, they are deciding whether to leave it the same or to change it, and so any suggestions you have for that form, they are welcome at this time.
Okay.
So please, whatever your thoughts are, let people know, and I can verify for you that that form will be submitted for renewal within the next 6 months, so you will see that information.
Okay. Thank you very much, David.
Great. Thanks for your question, Kathy. I'm going to mute you again. And we also have another question that was typed in. It reads, I heard that Section C under Part 5 was optional, but now I'm not sure I heard that correctly. Can you explain that again?
There are mandatory performance measures and optional performance measures, and they both have a Part 5 under them. So perhaps that's the confusion. But in the mandatory performance measures, which would be the energy bill data, Section C on high burden households is required.
Okay, and it looks like those are all the questions that we have for now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Melissa, for giving the introduction and the thoughtful review of resources that are available to everybody. And I hope that what I presented today and the team here helped develop was useful to you. If you have any questions after the webinar is ended, please feel free to reach out to us offline, and we can help you with any questions that you have. Thank you very much.